They gave their children everything, only to discover that in the end their children had no time left for them. For more than 40 years, Robert and Eleanor Hayes had built their entire lives around one purpose: giving their 3 children a future better than their own. Their small house was never luxurious, but every wall carried a memory. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, school celebrations, arguments followed by laughter. It was the place where Jason, Emily, and Noah had grown from noisy children into successful adults. Robert used to believe that all those sacrifices would keep the family close forever. He was wrong. Jason now lived hundreds of miles away with his wife and children. Emily had built a demanding career in another city, while Noah's job kept him constantly traveling. At first, Robert and Eleanor were proud, but slowly something changed. Phone calls became shorter. Messages became colder. Visits became rare. And eventually, the silence inside their once crowded home became impossible to ignore. Every morning, Robert still checked his phone, hoping one of his children would call. Most days no one did. Jason called this morning, Robert said quietly one day. Eleanor looked up hopefully. Is he coming to visit? Robert forced a smile. He was busy. That single word had become the answer to everything. Too busy to visit. Too busy to call. Too busy to notice that the 2 people who had spent their entire lives loving them were now growing old, completely alone. And neither Robert nor Eleanor knew that this painful realization would soon push them toward a decision that would change everything. For weeks after that quiet afternoon with the old photo album, Thomas and Margaret refused to give up. They called first. They sent messages first. They asked about the grandchildren, remembered birthdays, and gently suggested visits whenever they thought the timing might be right. But the answers were always the same, dressed in different words. Too much work. Too many plans. Maybe next weekend. Maybe next month. Maybe soon. And somehow soon never came. Then one afternoon, Margaret received a call from Claire. Her grandson was having a birthday party and the whole family would be there. For the first time in months, Margaret's face lit up. The moment she hung up, she hurried to find Thomas. She invited us, she said, almost breathless. Everyone will be there. Thomas looked at her, and for a second he saw the woman she had been years ago, full of excitement, already planning what gifts to buy and what clothes to wear. Neither of them wanted to admit how much that invitation meant. They spent days preparing. Margaret carefully chose presents for the grandchildren. Thomas checked the car twice before the trip. They even booked a small hotel nearby because they didn't want Claire to feel obligated to host them. We'll stay only as long as they want, Margaret said. Thomas smiled. Just seeing everyone will be enough. They drove for hours. The distance felt shorter than usual because they talked about the grandchildren, remembered old family trips, and imagined sitting at one table with all 3 of their children again. But the moment they arrived, something felt wrong. Music filled the house. Children ran across the yard. Guests laughed beneath strings of colorful decorations. Margaret squeezed Thomas's hand as they approached the entrance. Then Claire saw them. Her smile appeared instantly. But it didn't reach her eyes. Mom, Dad, she said, what a surprise. Thomas stopped. A surprise. Claire hesitated. You invited us 2 weeks ago. For a fraction of a second, panic crossed her face. Yes. Of course. There were some last-minute changes. Thomas said nothing. Margaret forced a smile. They entered. And the strange feeling only grew stronger. Whenever Thomas joined a conversation, people suddenly seemed to have somewhere else to be. When Margaret sat beside relatives she had known for years, the conversation became stiff and polite. Even their own children seemed distracted. Ethan checked his phone constantly. Claire moved from guest to guest, always busy with something. Lucas spoke with them briefly before disappearing back into the crowd. Thomas tried to convince himself they were imagining it. It was a party. Everyone was occupied. That was all. But Margaret knew. A mother could feel when she was welcome, and she could feel when she wasn't. Later that afternoon, Margaret walked down the hallway looking for the bathroom. As she passed a half-closed door, she heard Claire's voice from inside. She would have kept walking? Then she heard her own name. I still don't understand why they came. Margaret froze. Ethan answered. Because you invited them. I invited them because I felt like I had to. The hallway suddenly seemed colder. Margaret couldn't move. Claire continued. Every time they come, everything becomes about them. And then everyone feels guilty because they're always alone. A short silence followed. Then Ethan sighed. We can't spend our lives worrying about them. Exactly, Claire replied. We have our own lives now. Each word struck Margaret harder than the one before it. These were the children she had stayed awake with when they were sick. The children Thomas had worked endless hours to support. The children they had spent 40 years protecting from every hardship they could. And now their loneliness was an inconvenience. Margaret slowly stepped away from the door. When she returned to the garden, Thomas saw her face and immediately knew something had happened. What is it? Nothing. But after 40 years of marriage, there were some lies Thomas could recognize before they were even spoken. He waited. And eventually, Margaret told him everything. Thomas didn't become angry. He didn't storm inside. He didn't confront anyone. He simply lowered his eyes. That silence frightened Margaret more than anger ever could. They left the party that same evening. On the long drive home, neither of them spoke. Hours earlier, they had traveled that road filled with hope. Now there was only the sound of the engine and the unbearable weight of words they were never supposed to hear. When they finally reached their empty house, Thomas sat at the kitchen table while Margaret made coffee. For a long time they stared at the cups between them. Then Thomas quietly said, "I think I finally understand." Margaret looked at him. "Our children may still love us." He paused. "But they no longer have a place for us in their lives." And that night, something inside both of them began to change. The days after the birthday party passed quietly. Too quietly. Thomas and Margaret never told their children what Margaret had overheard. They didn't demand explanations. They didn't accuse anyone. They simply returned to their familiar routine and tried to behave as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. For years, the silence in their house had felt temporary, as if at any moment the phone might ring, a car might pull into the driveway, or one of their children might suddenly appear at the door. Now the silence felt different. It felt permanent. Then a few weeks later, something happened that shattered the last piece of hope they were still holding on to. Thomas was repairing an old window outside the house when his foot slipped. Margaret heard the crash from the kitchen. "Thomas." She ran outside and found him on the ground, one hand pressed against his forehead. Blood ran slowly between his fingers. For one terrifying second, Margaret could not breathe. At the hospital, the doctor assured her that Thomas had been lucky. The fall had not caused any serious damage, but he needed several stitches and a few days of rest. Margaret nodded, relieved. Then she reached for her phone. Surely this time would be different. She called Ethan first. "Your father fell," she said. "He's all right, but he had to get stitches." There was a short silence. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I have meetings all week. I'll call Dad tonight." He never did. Claire sounded concerned too. "Oh my God, is he okay?" "Yes," Margaret replied. "He's home now. I wish I could come, but things are impossible here. Maybe this weekend." The weekend came. Claire didn't. Lucas promised to rearrange his schedule. "I'll see what I can do." Margaret already knew what those words meant. Nothing. 3 children. 3 promises. Not one visit. That evening, Thomas rested on the sofa beneath a thin blanket while Margaret sat beside him. His face looked tired. Older somehow. She stared at the man who had spent decades fixing broken doors, carrying heavy boxes, working late hours, and solving every problem their family had ever faced. Whenever the children had needed him, Thomas had found a way. No matter how tired he was. No matter how far he had to drive. No matter what he had to sacrifice. And now, when he needed nothing more than a few hours of their time, no one came. Margaret looked toward the phone on the table. It remained silent. "I don't want to do this anymore," she said. Thomas turned his head. "Do what?" "Wait." Her voice trembled, but she continued. "I don't want to wake up every morning wondering if they'll call. I don't want to spend every holiday hoping they'll visit. I don't want to keep convincing myself that next month will be different." Thomas watched her quietly. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "We gave them our whole lives, Thomas. And I don't regret that. I would do it again." She paused. "But maybe we don't have to give them the rest of our lives too." The words settled between them. For the first time, Thomas did not defend the children. He didn't say they were busy. He didn't say they had responsibilities. He didn't say things would eventually improve. Because somewhere deep inside he was tired too. Tired of checking his phone. Tired of empty chairs at the dinner table. Tired of waiting for people who had already chosen another direction. That night something unusual happened. They stopped talking about Ethan. They stopped talking about Claire. They stopped talking about Lucas and the grandchildren. Instead they talked about themselves. "What would you do?" Margaret asked softly. "If we didn't have to wait for anyone anymore." Thomas thought for a long moment. "I'd like to wake up somewhere quiet." Margaret smiled faintly. "Somewhere with trees. And enough land for a garden." She laughed, the first real laugh he had heard from her in weeks. They talked until after midnight. About places they had once dreamed of visiting. About mornings without disappointment. About spending whatever years remained doing something because they wanted to do it, not because someone else needed them. Then the conversation reached the one thing neither of them had dared to say. Thomas looked around the kitchen. The walls held more than 4 decades of memories. "We could sell the house." Margaret froze. This was the house where their children had taken their first steps. where birthdays had been celebrated, where Christmas mornings had once begun with laughter before sunrise. Selling it felt almost like selling part of themselves. But Margaret looked around and realized something else. They were no longer living among memories. They were living inside them. And memories were becoming a cage. She reached across the table and took Thomas's hand. Are we really ready to leave all this behind? Thomas looked at her. No. Then he squeezed her hand. But I think we're finally ready to move forward. And before the sun rose the next morning, Thomas and Margaret made the most frightening and perhaps the most important decision of their lives. They would sell the house. They would stop waiting. And for the first time in decades they would choose themselves. Selling the house was harder than Thomas and Margaret had imagined. For weeks, strangers walked through rooms that had once belonged only to their family. They opened doors, measured walls, inspected windows, and spoke casually about renovations while Margaret stood nearby, remembering first steps, birthday cakes, Christmas mornings, and children racing through the hallway. Every room held a piece of their life. The kitchen still carried the memory of hurried breakfasts before school. The living room seemed to echo with laughter that had disappeared years ago. Even the small yard brought back images of summer evenings when all three children had once been home. Packing those memories into boxes felt like dismantling an entire lifetime. But neither Thomas nor Margaret changed their minds. They had finally understood that staying would mean continuing to live inside a past that no longer existed. When the house was finally sold, the amount they received was modest. It was enough to begin again, but not enough for comfort or luxury. Fortunately, luxury was not what they wanted. They wanted peace. Space. A place where silence would no longer feel like rejection. For days they searched through property listings. Some homes were too expensive. Others looked beautiful in photographs but were nearly unlivable in person. After several disappointing visits, Thomas began to wonder whether they had made a terrible mistake. Then Margaret found the advertisement. It showed a wide stretch of overgrown land surrounded by trees. An old wooden farmhouse stood near the center with broken fences and abandoned animal pens scattered around it. But what immediately caught Thomas's attention was the enormous barn behind the house. Its metal roof was rusted and bent in several places. Some windows were shattered. One of the large doors hung slightly crooked. And the price was shockingly low. This has to be a mistake, Thomas said. Margaret stared at the screen. Or there's something they're not telling us. The next morning they drove out to see it. The farther they traveled, the narrower the roads became. Towns turned into villages, villages became scattered houses, and eventually even those disappeared behind long stretches of empty countryside. Margaret looked out the window. Does anyone actually live out here? Thomas smiled. Maybe that's the point. When the farm finally appeared in the distance, both of them fell silent. It was neglected. Wild grass covered much of the land. The farmhouse clearly needed repairs, several sections of fencing had collapsed, and yet there was something strangely beautiful about it. The trees were tall. The air was clean. There was no traffic. No ringing phones. No expectations. For the first time in years, Thomas felt like he could breathe. Then he looked toward the barn. Up close, it was even larger than the photographs suggested. It stood like a dark monument in the middle of the property, weathered by decades but still strangely imposing. The owner, a nervous man named Walter Green, met them near the entrance and showed them around. He answered every question easily until Thomas pointed toward the barn. What's the story with that building? Walter hesitated. Nothing important. Margaret noticed immediately. What kind of nothing? Walter forced a laugh. Old local stories. People around here like to talk. About what? He looked toward the barn. Ghosts. Strange lights. Noises at night. That kind of thing. Thomas smiled. So nothing real? Nothing anyone has ever proven. Later, Thomas and Margaret stopped at a small cafe in the nearest town. They had barely finished ordering when an elderly waitress approached their table. You're the couple looking at the old farm, aren't you? Margaret blinked. How did you know? The woman gave a dry smile. People hear things quickly around here. Then her expression changed. If I were you, I'd find somewhere else. Thomas leaned forward. Why? The waitress lowered her voice. Because people don't stay there very long. A man at another table laughed. Don't scare them with those old stories. But soon several customers were talking. Lights appearing inside the barn after midnight. Metallic noises when the building was empty. People who claimed to see movement behind broken windows. Even rumors of disappearances from decades earlier. On the drive back, Margaret was quiet. That's a lot of stories for one place. Thomas kept his eyes on the road. Stories grow when people are afraid. 2 days later, they returned. And this time another man was waiting. His name was Victor Hale. Well-dressed, calm, watchful. He looked at Thomas, then at Margaret, then toward the barn. If you're thinking of buying this place, he said, don't. Thomas crossed his arms. Why not? Victor smiled. Because that farm brings nothing but trouble. His warning should have frightened them. Instead, it made Thomas curious. Because Victor did not sound superstitious. He sounded worried. A week later, Thomas and Margaret signed the papers. They bought the farm. And as they stood outside their new home for the first time, neither of them realized that the place everyone feared was about to give them something they had never expected. A mystery buried far deeper than the dead silence of an abandoned barn. The first few weeks at the farm were exhausting, but for Thomas and Margaret, exhaustion felt strangely good. Every morning gave them a reason to get out of bed. There were leaking windows to repair, fences to straighten, weeds to clear, and rooms that had been untouched for years. The farmhouse creaked in the wind, dust covered nearly every surface, and the yard looked as though nature had been slowly swallowing it. But for the first time in a very long time, they were not waiting for a phone call. They were building something again. Thomas would rise before sunrise and make coffee while Margaret planned what they could finish that day. They worked side by side, sometimes arguing over where to place a piece of furniture, sometimes laughing when a simple repair turned into an hour-long disaster. And little by little, the abandoned farmhouse began to feel alive. I think this place is making us younger, Margaret joked one afternoon. Thomas grinned. Or just too tired to remember how old we are? For a while, everything felt exactly as they had hoped. Then the strange things began. The first incident was so small that Thomas almost ignored it. He had been repairing a section of fence when he left his toolbox beside the house. He went inside for only a few minutes. When he returned, the toolbox was gone. Thomas searched the yard, the porch, and the shed. Nothing. Nearly an hour later, he found it inside the old barn. Closed, untouched, placed neatly beside one of the interior walls. Thomas stared at it for several seconds. He was certain he had not carried it there. That evening when he told Margaret, she laughed. You're finally starting to forget things. Not that badly, he replied. They dismissed it. 2 days later, Margaret stopped laughing. She had placed the house keys on the kitchen table while organizing a cabinet. Minutes later, they were gone. She checked her pockets, the table, the drawers, her bag. Nothing. Eventually, she found them hanging from a hook in the laundry room. A hook she had never used. That night, she looked across the dinner table at Thomas. I think what happened to your tools just happened to me. Thomas tried to sound calm. We're tired. New house. New routines. Margaret nodded. But neither of them truly believed it. Then came the noises. Just before 3 in the morning, Thomas woke to a sharp metallic crash from somewhere outside. He sat upright. Silence. Then it came again. Metal against metal. From the direction of the barn. He walked quietly to the window and stared into the darkness. Nothing moved. By morning, he inspected the building carefully. The doors were still closed. No windows appeared newly broken. There were no obvious signs of animals or intruders. But the uneasiness remained. A few days later, Thomas and Margaret were working in the yard when one of the side doors of the farmhouse suddenly swung open behind them. Margaret jumped. Thomas walked over and checked the lock. It worked perfectly. There's almost no wind, he said. Maybe we didn't close it properly. Thomas didn't answer. He remembered locking it himself. After that, they began noticing more. Tools appeared in different places. Doors were open in the morning even though they had been locked the night before. An old padlock they had secured to a storage door was found lying on the ground. Then, after a light rain, Thomas discovered footprints near the barn. Human footprints. They crossed the wet ground toward the building and then seemed to disappear where the soil became dry. Margaret stood beside him. What if someone's coming here at night? For the first time, that explanation frightened Thomas more than the ghost stories. He installed a motion-sensitive light near the barn and checked every lock on the property. For 2 nights, nothing happened. On the third, they both woke to the sound. A long metallic scraping. Then another. It sounded like someone dragging a chain across the barn floor. Margaret grabbed Thomas's arm. Don't go out there. They moved to the bedroom window. The motion light was off. No shadows. No movement. Yet the noise continued for several seconds before stopping suddenly. By morning, the barn looked untouched. Except for one old shovel. Thomas was certain it had been lying flat against a pile of wood the night before. Now it stood upright against the opposite wall. That afternoon, a familiar black vehicle appeared on the road. Victor Hale stepped out. He looked at the house. Then the barn. Then at Thomas and Margaret. I see you're still here, he said. Thomas frowned. We bought the place to live here. Victor smiled faintly. Others said the same thing. Margaret felt a chill. Then Victor made an unexpected offer. He wanted to buy the farm. For far more than they had paid. Thomas refused immediately. But Margaret asked the question that had been bothering her since their first meeting. Why do you want this place so badly? For the first time, Victor's smile disappeared. Only for a second. Then he looked toward the barn. I just like land in this area. It was not a convincing answer. And as Victor drove away, Thomas watched the black vehicle disappear down the road. The noises. The missing objects. The open doors. The footprints. And now Victor's obsession with the property. For the first time, Thomas wondered whether the farm was haunted at all. Because whatever was moving through the darkness around that barn might not have been a ghost. It might have been someone who desperately wanted them to believe in one. Victor Hale's offer should have felt like good news. Instead, it left Thomas and Margaret more unsettled than any midnight noise ever had. For the next several days they talked about him constantly. Why would a man offer far more than the farm was worth only weeks after they had bought it? Why had he warned them not to purchase the property in the first place? And most troubling of all, why did his eyes always drift toward the barn? Thomas tried to remain practical. Maybe he wants the land for some business project. Margaret shook her head. Then why doesn't he say that? Thomas had no answer. The following morning they drove into town for supplies. But this time nails and lumber were not the only things on their minds. They wanted information. At a small hardware store near the town square, an elderly shopkeeper named Arthur Bennett recognized them almost immediately. You're the couple living at the old farm, aren't you? Thomas gave a tired smile. Apparently everyone knows us. Arthur chuckled. In a town this small, privacy is mostly a rumor. Margaret leaned closer. Did you know the man who owned the farm before it was abandoned? Arthur's expression changed. The humor disappeared from his face. Samuel Whitmore, he said quietly. Yes. I knew him. Thomas and Margaret exchanged a glance. Until that moment, Samuel had been nothing more than a name attached to an old property. Arthur pulled out a chair. He was a strange man. Not dangerous. Just private. Worked constantly and spent more time in that barn than anywhere else. Margaret felt a familiar uneasiness. At night too? Arthur nodded. Especially at night. He told them that years ago people sometimes saw lights glowing through the barn windows long after midnight. Samuel rarely explained what he was doing. Then one day without warning he disappeared. No goodbye. No body. No clear explanation. Police searched the farm, questioned neighbors, and examined the surrounding land. They found nothing. Afterward stories spread. Some people claimed to hear metal scraping inside the empty barn. Others saw lights moving behind broken windows. Every new owner eventually left. Thomas listened carefully. Were they afraid of ghosts? Arthur gave him a long look. Some were. And the others? Arthur hesitated. They believed someone wanted them gone. The words followed Thomas and Margaret all the way home. When they reached the farm, Thomas walked directly toward the barn. This time he did not look at it as an old building filled with village legends. He looked at it as evidence. Near one side wall something caught his attention. Tire tracks. Fresh ones. The ground was still soft from rain earlier in the week and the marks were clear enough to see. Margaret crouched beside him. Those weren't here before. Thomas slowly stood. No. They both looked toward the empty road. Neither needed to say Victor's name. That night they decided not to go to bed early. They sat in the darkened living room with only a small lamp burning beside them. The television remained off. 10 o'clock passed. Then 11. Midnight approached. Nothing. Margaret was beginning to wonder if they had frightened themselves over nothing when a sound rolled across the property. Clang. Both of them froze. Another metallic strike followed. Then another? It came from the barn. Thomas reached for his flashlight. Before he could stand, Margaret grabbed his wrist. Wait. They stared through the window. For several seconds the barn remained dark. Then, a flash of light appeared behind one of the broken windows. It lasted less than a second. But they both saw it. That wasn't lightning, Margaret whispered. There aren't any clouds. Thomas's pulse quickened. A second light moved inside the barn. Not flickering. Moving. Like someone carrying a flashlight. Thomas started toward the door but Margaret stepped in front of him. If someone is really out there, you don't know what they want. He stopped. She was right. For months people had told them the farm was haunted. But ghosts did not leave tire tracks. Ghosts did not move tools carefully from one place to another. Ghosts did not offer enormous amounts of money for land. And ghosts did not arrive in black vehicles asking questions about barns. The light vanished. Silence returned. But Thomas no longer felt confused. He felt certain. Someone was entering their property. Someone wanted them frightened. And whoever it was seemed to believe that if Thomas and Margaret became afraid enough they would sell the farm and disappear just like everyone before them. The next afternoon Victor returned. He stepped from his vehicle with the same calm smile. Have you reconsidered my offer? Thomas stared at him. No. Victor's expression barely changed. I can increase it. We're still not selling. For a moment Victor said nothing. Then his eyes moved past Thomas. Straight toward the barn. Margaret saw it. Thomas saw it too. And suddenly the question was no longer whether Victor wanted the farm. The question was, what was inside that barn that made him want it so desperately? After Victor's latest visit, Thomas could no longer look at the barn without wondering what it was hiding. For days he searched every corner of the old structure. He examined the walls, tested loose boards, inspected rusted locks, and even checked beneath piles of broken machinery. Margaret helped whenever she could, though neither of them truly knew what they were looking for. If Victor wanted the property badly enough to frighten people away, there had to be a reason. But the barn gave them nothing. Then the storm came. It began late one afternoon when the sky turned an unnatural shade of gray. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching thick clouds gather over the fields. That doesn't look good. Thomas stepped beside her. The wind was already bending the trees. We should secure everything outside. They spent the next hour fastening doors, moving tools indoors, and checking the windows. By sunset, the first drops of rain had begun to fall. Within minutes, the farm disappeared beneath a wall of water. Thunder shook the windows. Lightning tore across the sky. The old house groaned under the force of the wind, but Thomas and Margaret remained inside listening as the storm battered the property. Then, shortly after 10 o'clock, a violent crash exploded from the direction of the barn. Margaret jumped to her feet. What was that? Thomas rushed to the window. A flash of lightning illuminated the field. For one brief second, he saw part of the barn roof hanging at an unnatural angle. I think something collapsed. Are you going out there? Not in this. They had no choice but to wait. Neither slept well that night. At dawn, the storm had passed. The farm looked wounded. Branches covered the ground. Mud filled the paths. Pieces of metal roofing were scattered across the field. Thomas and Margaret walked toward the barn carefully. The damage was worse than they expected. Part of the roof had collapsed inward, bringing down a heavy wooden beam. Several sheets of rusted metal lay twisted across the floor. Thomas stepped over the debris. Then he stopped. The fallen beam had struck a section of concrete near the back of the barn. A large crack now ran across the floor. Margaret. Something in his voice made her hurry over. Thomas knelt beside the damaged concrete and brushed away the dust. The crack was deeper than it should have been. Much deeper. He picked up a metal bar and carefully removed one loose fragment. Beneath it was darkness. Margaret stared. There's empty space under the floor. Thomas removed another piece. Then another. A rusted metal surface slowly appeared beneath the broken concrete. They looked at each other. This wasn't part of the foundation. It was a door. For the next several hours they worked in silence, clearing away the rubble until a large steel hatch was completely visible. A thick handle sat in its center, nearly buried beneath decades of rust. Margaret touched it cautiously. How long has this been here? Thomas stared at the metal. Long enough for someone to make sure no one ever found it. He tried to pull the handle. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. Finally, using the metal bar for leverage, Thomas forced it upward. A deep cracking sound echoed through the barn. The hatch moved. A breath of freezing air rose from below. Margaret stepped backward. Thomas slowly lifted the door farther. Beneath them was a narrow staircase descending into complete darkness. For several seconds neither spoke. Every strange event suddenly seemed to carry new meaning. The noises. The lights. Victor's obsession. The warnings. Thomas aimed his flashlight downward. The beam disappeared into the blackness. We should call someone, Margaret whispered. Thomas knew she was right. But another thought was stronger. If they called the authorities before understanding what they had found, whatever secret had survived beneath this barn for decades might disappear into someone else's hands. Just a quick look, he said. Margaret gave him a look that said she hated the idea. Then she reached for another flashlight. If you're going down there, you're not going alone. Thomas smiled faintly. Wouldn't dream of it. He descended first. The stairs were old but solid. With each step, the temperature dropped. At the bottom they found a narrow tunnel built from stone and concrete. It stretched beneath the earth far beyond the reach of their lights. Margaret's breathing became shallow. This wasn't built for storage. Thomas said nothing. They walked slowly forward. The tunnel continued for several minutes before opening toward something much larger. Then their flashlight beams struck metal. A massive door stood in front of them. Unlike the rusted hatch above, this one looked far more carefully constructed. Thomas reached for the handle. It was unlocked. Margaret grabbed his arm. Thomas. He looked at her. Then back at the door. Whatever Victor Hale had been searching for, whatever had turned this barn into a place people feared for decades, was waiting on the other side. Thomas pushed. The metal door groaned open. And both of them stopped breathing. Thomas pushed the metal door wider. The sound rolled through the underground passage like a warning. For several seconds neither he nor Margaret moved. Their flashlights swept slowly across the darkness beyond the doorway, revealing something neither of them had been prepared to see. It was not a small cellar. It was an enormous underground chamber. Rows of metal shelves stretched deep into the darkness. Wooden crates were stacked against the walls. Old filing cabinets stood beneath layers of dust, and heavy tables were covered with objects that looked as though they had not been touched in decades. Margaret stepped inside carefully. "My God?" Thomas could barely answer. The room was far too large, far too organized, and far too deliberate to have been built for ordinary farm storage. Someone had created this place to hide something, and they had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure it stayed hidden. Thomas approached the nearest crate and brushed away a thick layer of dust. "Should we open it?" Margaret hesitated. After everything they had experienced, curiosity had become mixed with something darker. Fear? Still she nodded. Thomas slowly lifted the lid. Inside were carefully wrapped bundles of documents. Not newspapers. Not personal letters. Official papers. Property deeds. Contracts. Notarial records. Certificates bearing names and dates from decades earlier. Margaret picked up one folder. These were protected from moisture. Thomas examined the wrapping. Someone wanted them to survive. They moved to another box. This one was smaller. When Margaret opened it, she froze. Inside were rows of velvet cases. She lifted one. A diamond ring caught the light from her flashlight. Another case contained a gold necklace. Then came watches, bracelets, brooches, pieces of jewelry that looked far too valuable to have been forgotten beneath an abandoned barn. Thomas stared at the shelves surrounding them. If all of these boxes contained things like this, he did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They continued deeper into the chamber. Another metal container held old coins arranged in cloth-lined trays. Some appeared to be gold. Nearby they discovered several small bars wrapped carefully against moisture. Margaret's hands began to tremble. Thomas, this could be worth a fortune. But strangely, the money was no longer what frightened him most. It was the question behind it. Why had someone hidden so much wealth beneath a farm? And why had Victor Hale been so desperate to buy the property? Thomas turned slowly, staring at the endless shelves. Every strange sound they had heard now seemed different. Every moved tool. Every open door. Every unexplained light inside the barn. Maybe none of it had ever been about ghosts. Maybe someone had been searching. At the far end of the chamber, Margaret noticed a large wooden table. Thomas. He followed her flashlight. Unlike the chaotic stacks nearby, the table held only a few objects. Photographs. Several folders. And one thick leather-bound notebook placed carefully in the center. Margaret approached it slowly. There was something deliberate about its position, almost as though whoever had left it there wanted it to be found. Thomas picked it up. The leather was aged but surprisingly well preserved. He opened the cover. On the first page, a name had been written in dark ink. Samuel Whitmore. Thomas looked at Margaret. The former owner. The man who had spent countless nights inside the barn. The man who had vanished without explanation. Margaret felt a chill move through her. So this was his. Thomas began turning the pages. The handwriting was neat. The earliest entries seemed ordinary. Repairs to the farm. Purchases. Weather. Crops. Expenses. Nothing that could explain an underground chamber filled with valuables. But as Thomas continued turning pages, the entries slowly began to change. There were references to visitors arriving late at night, families who needed help, people identified only by initials, money transferred secretly, documents stored for protection. Margaret leaned closer. This wasn't just a farm. Thomas's eyes remained fixed on the page. No, he looked around the hidden chamber again. The jewels. The property records. The photographs. The carefully sealed boxes. Whatever Samuel Whitmore had been doing here had been far bigger than either of them imagined. And suddenly the treasure beneath their feet no longer felt like a miracle. It felt like evidence. Evidence of a secret that had survived for decades. A secret powerful enough to make one man disappear, and another man spend years trying to find it. Thomas kept reading. At first the entries still seemed fragmented, names reduced to initials, dates without explanation, short notes about people arriving after dark. But the deeper he went into Samuel Whitmore's journal, the clearer the pattern became. Margaret stood beside him, one hand resting on the edge of the dusty table. What was he doing? She whispered. Thomas turned another page. Then another. And slowly the answer began to emerge. Samuel Whitmore had not been hiding stolen wealth. He had been hiding people. Not permanently. Long enough to save them. According to the journal, there had been a period years earlier when families across the region were being threatened, driven from their homes, or targeted because of political conflicts, local power struggles, and men who believed fear gave them the right to control others. Some families lost property. Others were followed. Some had nowhere safe to go. Samuel became part of a quiet network that helped them disappear before the danger could reach them. Farmers, shopkeepers, lawyers, a few government workers. Ordinary people who had decided that watching innocent families suffer was no longer acceptable. They moved in silence. No public meetings. No official records. No names written in full unless absolutely necessary. Samuel's farm became one of their safest locations. Families would arrive after midnight, sometimes in old trucks, sometimes on foot, carrying only what they could hold. Samuel gave them food, a place to rest, fresh clothes, temporary documents, directions to the next safe location. Then before sunrise they would leave again. Margaret slowly sat down. All those lights people saw in the barn, Thomas looked up. They weren't ghosts. They were people. The realization hung between them. The stories that had terrified the town for decades had been built on something painfully human. Fear, desperation, survival. Thomas continued reading. Some entries described children arriving exhausted after traveling for days. One mentioned a mother who refused to eat until she knew her 2 sons were safe. Another told of an elderly man who had buried his family papers because he believed soldiers would take them. Samuel never wrote about himself as a hero. In fact, the journal barely spoke of courage at all. He wrote about practical things. Who needed medicine? Which road was being watched? Which family required new documents? Where fuel could be obtained without attracting attention? Which house could safely receive people the following night? It was as though saving lives had become another daily chore. Like repairing a fence, feeding animals, harvesting crops. Margaret wiped at her eyes. He lived here alone, and everyone thought he was strange. Thomas closed the journal for a moment. Maybe he needed them to think that. The secrecy had protected more than Samuel. It had protected everyone connected to him. If authorities or powerful local figures had discovered the network, dozens of families could have been exposed. Thomas opened the journal again. Then they found the entries that explained the underground chamber. People escaping danger often brought jewelry, deeds, coins, family heirlooms, and anything valuable enough to help them rebuild their lives. But traveling with those possessions made them targets. So Samuel offered another kind of protection. He stored the valuables here, beneath the barn, hidden from thieves, hidden from officials, hidden from anyone who might take advantage of families already running for their lives. Margaret looked around at the shelves differently now. The rings were no longer treasure. The coins were no longer wealth. The documents were no longer old paper. Every object belonged to a story, a family, a life interrupted. Samuel had intended to return everything once the danger passed. But the journal revealed that many never came back. Some disappeared. Some died. Some escaped so far away that contact was lost forever. And so the belongings remained, waiting beneath the earth, waiting for people who would never return. Thomas's voice grew quieter as he read the final line on the page. If they survive, then what we hide here has served its purpose. Margaret looked at him. For several seconds neither spoke. The chamber no longer felt like a treasure room. It felt like a memorial. And Samuel Whitmore was no longer simply the mysterious farmer who had vanished decades ago. He was a man who had risked everything to protect strangers. But as Thomas turned toward the later pages of the journal, the handwriting began to change. The sentences became shorter, more urgent, and one phrase began appearing again and again. Someone is watching the farm. Thomas stopped. Margaret felt the warmth leave her face. Because suddenly Samuel's story was no longer only about the past. It was beginning to sound terrifyingly familiar. Thomas stared at the words for a long time. Someone is watching the farm. The sentence seemed to darken the entire chamber around them. For a moment Margaret forgot about the gold, the jewelry, the documents, even Victor Hale. All she could think about was Samuel Whitmore sitting somewhere in this same underground room decades earlier, writing those words while knowing that danger was moving closer. Thomas turned the page. The next entries revealed something even more heartbreaking. The valuables hidden beneath the barn had never belonged to Samuel. Not truly. Each box, each velvet case, each bundle of documents had been entrusted to him by families who were fleeing for their lives. A gold necklace might have belonged to a mother who had received it on her wedding day. A watch might have been the last possession a father inherited from his own father. A property deed could represent generations of work. A handful of coins might have been everything a family had managed to save before abandoning their home in the middle of the night. Samuel had recorded many of them carefully. Names, dates, descriptions. Sometimes, even short notes about where the owners hoped to go. Margaret opened one of the smaller boxes and lifted a delicate bracelet. Earlier it had looked beautiful. Now it felt unbearably heavy. This belonged to someone, she whispered. Thomas nodded. Someone who probably believed they would come back for it. That was the plan. Samuel would protect the belongings until the danger passed. When the families were safe, they could return, reclaim what was theirs and use it to rebuild their lives. But history had not been kind enough to make the plan work. Some families disappeared before anyone knew whether they reached safety. Others died during their escape. Some crossed borders and never returned. A few sent letters years later, but communication eventually stopped. And many names simply vanished from the records. The chamber had slowly become filled with possessions whose owners never came back. Margaret moved between the shelves in silence. She no longer saw treasure. She saw unfinished goodbyes. A wedding ring waiting for a hand that would never wear it again. A stack of legal papers belonging to a family that might never have seen their home again. Coins saved for a future that had been interrupted. Photographs of people whose descendants might not even know those images still existed. "This isn't ours," Margaret said firmly. Thomas looked at her. "I know. Even if the law says the property belongs to us, this doesn't." Thomas understood exactly what she meant. The farm might be theirs. The barn might be theirs. The underground chamber might legally sit beneath their land. But what was inside carried the weight of other lives. They continued reading. Samuel had written repeatedly about his responsibility to preserve the property of those who trusted him. He seemed almost obsessed with keeping detailed records, as though he believed that one day someone would have to finish the work he could not. Then Thomas found an entry that made him stop. Samuel described receiving a family late one winter night. They had arrived frightened and exhausted, carrying only 2 bags and a small wooden case. Inside were jewelry, documents, and several old coins. Before leaving, the father had placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder. According to the journal, he had said only one thing: "Keep this until my children are safe." There was no later entry confirming that the family returned. Margaret turned away. Her eyes had filled with tears. For years, she and Thomas had suffered because their own children had become distant. But standing there, surrounded by the belongings of families torn apart by fear and violence, Margaret felt something shift inside her. There were many kinds of loss. Some came through death. Some through distance. Some through choices people made. And some came because the world had simply become too dangerous to stay together. Thomas closed the journal carefully. "We need to find out who these people were." Margaret looked at the endless shelves. If any of their families are still alive, they deserve to know. It was the first decision they made without hesitation. But as Thomas returned the journal to the table, his eyes fell again on the later pages. Several sections had been torn out. Not damaged. Removed. Deliberately. And suddenly another thought returned. If Samuel had protected these belongings for families who vanished, then perhaps someone else had spent decades trying to claim what was never theirs. And somewhere inside this chamber might be the evidence proving exactly who that person was. Thomas stood motionless beside the table, staring at the torn pages in Samuel Whitmore's journal. They had not fallen out with age. They had not been damaged by moisture. They had been removed. Carefully. Deliberately. Margaret ran her fingers along the uneven edge where several pages had once been bound. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for. Thomas said nothing. He was thinking about Victor. About the lights inside the barn. The tools that had moved. The tire tracks. The offers to buy the farm. And now this. They began searching the chamber again, but this time they were no longer looking at it as curious newcomers. They were looking for evidence. Thomas moved slowly between the shelves, shining his flashlight across the floor. That was when he noticed something that had escaped them before. Footprints. Fresh footprints. A thin layer of dust covered most of the underground chamber, but across one section of the floor several clear marks broke the surface. Thomas crouched. "These are recent." Margaret stepped closer. The tracks crossed the chamber and stopped near a row of storage shelves. Several boxes there had been opened. Not emptied. Opened. Their lids rested at strange angles. Documents had been shifted. Folders had been disturbed. Yet boxes filled with jewelry remained untouched. Coins still sat where Samuel had left them. Gold bars had not been taken. Margaret looked around confused. If someone knew this place existed, why wouldn't they take the valuables? Thomas stared at the disturbed shelves. Because money wasn't what they came for. The answer made the chamber feel colder. They followed the footprints farther. Then Margaret saw something lying on a nearby table. A flashlight. At first it seemed ordinary. Then Thomas picked it up. It was modern. Clean. Almost no dust covered it. Everything else in the chamber looked as though it had been sleeping underground for decades. This did not. Margaret's face changed. "Someone has been down here recently." Thomas nodded. The conclusion was unavoidable. Before the storm exposed the hidden hatch to them, someone else had already known how to enter. Someone had been using this place. Searching. Waiting. Perhaps returning night after night? Suddenly, every unexplained event from the previous weeks had an answer that was far more frightening than ghosts. The metallic sounds from the barn. The light moving behind the windows. The doors found open. The objects mysteriously relocated. They had not been supernatural warnings. They had been signs of intrusion. Margaret hugged her arms against herself. Do you think they were trying to scare us away? Thomas looked toward the passage leading back to the tunnel. I think they wanted the farm empty. They searched the disturbed boxes more carefully. Most contained documents. Names. Property records. Letters. Old lists connected to Samuel's secret network. Someone had clearly gone through them in a hurry yet had ignored objects worth thousands, perhaps millions. Then Margaret looked back at the journal. The missing pages. Thomas followed her gaze. What if that's what they were looking for? It made sense. Samuel's final entries had grown increasingly fearful. He believed someone inside the network had betrayed them. He had written about surveillance, stolen information, and strangers appearing around the farm, and just before the journal might have revealed who was responsible, the pages disappeared. Thomas felt a pressure building in his chest. This was no longer simply a mystery from the past. Someone alive today still cared about what Samuel had written decades ago. Someone cared enough to enter the property secretly. Someone cared enough to frighten previous owners away. And someone cared enough to search an underground vault full of gold while ignoring the gold completely. Margaret looked toward Thomas. Victor. Neither of them needed to explain the name. His face appeared in both their minds instantly. The way he had warned them not to buy the farm. The way he kept returning. The way his eyes always drifted toward the barn. The enormous amount of money he had offered. Thomas placed the modern flashlight back on the table. If Victor knows about this chamber, then he doesn't want the land. Margaret looked around at the disturbed documents. He wants something inside it. They climbed back to the surface before sunset. For the first time since buying the farm, Thomas locked the barn and checked the door twice. Then 3 times. That night, neither of them slept easily. Because now they understood something they had not understood before. The secret beneath the barn had never truly been forgotten. Someone had been protecting it. Or hunting it. And now that Thomas and Margaret had discovered the chamber, they were no longer innocent owners of an abandoned farm. They had become part of the secret. And somewhere outside, someone already knew it. The next morning, Thomas and Margaret returned underground with one purpose. They were no longer searching for treasure. They were searching for Victor Hale. Not the man himself, but his name. His history. Anything that could explain why he had been circling the farm since before they even bought it. For hours, they opened boxes of letters, reports, and handwritten records from Samuel Whitmore's final years. Then Margaret suddenly stopped. Thomas. He looked up. She was holding a yellowed sheet of paper. One name had been underlined in Samuel's handwriting. Edwin Hale. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Hale? Margaret nodded slowly. The same name as Victor. They read the document together. Samuel described Edwin as a man who had become dangerously interested in the property documents and valuables protected by the secret network. He had repeatedly asked questions about where certain possessions were being stored. Samuel did not trust him. Worse, several notes suggested Edwin had been trying to obtain information that was never meant to leave the organization. Thomas searched another folder. Then Margaret found an old photograph. Several men stood outside a building, their faces faded by time. Names had been written across the back. One of them was Edwin Hale. Margaret stared at the man in the photograph. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same narrow eyes. The same sharp jaw. The same expression Victor wore whenever he looked toward the barn. That could be his grandfather, she whispered. Thomas felt every unexplained event suddenly pull together. Victor had not stumbled across the farm. His family had known about it. Perhaps for generations. And if Edwin had spent years searching for Samuel's hidden chamber, Victor might simply have inherited the obsession. Over the next few days, the pressure around the farm increased. A section of fencing Thomas had recently repaired was found broken. Several tools disappeared. Then a window in one of the storage buildings was shattered. Nothing was stolen. That was what frightened Margaret most. These aren't robberies, she said. No, Thomas replied. They're warnings. That night they reviewed their security footage. At 2:47 inches the morning, a shadow appeared near the barn. A person. The image was too dark to identify the face, but the figure moved slowly around the entrance, inspecting it before disappearing beyond the camera's view. Thomas replayed the footage 3 times. They're watching us. Margaret felt a cold knot tighten inside her chest. The following afternoon, Victor's black vehicle appeared at the end of the road. This time he did not arrive smiling. He stepped from the car with a tense expression and walked directly toward them. I know what you found, he said. Thomas's body stiffened. Victor looked toward the barn. And I know you've been going through old family records. Margaret stared at him. How could you possibly know that? Victor was silent for several seconds. Then he finally stopped pretending. My family has been searching for what's under this farm for more than 50 years. The words landed heavily. Thomas stepped closer. Edwin Hale. Victor's eyes changed. It was only a flicker. But it was enough. So you found his name? He was your grandfather, wasn't he? Margaret asked. Victor nodded. My grandfather knew Samuel Whitmore. He always believed Samuel was hiding something valuable somewhere on this property. He searched for years but never found it. Thomas's voice hardened. And why did he want it? Victor hesitated. He believed some of the property belonged to people who never returned to claim it. The answer sounded rehearsed. Incomplete. Thomas thought of Samuel's warnings. The missing pages. The disturbed files. The man moving through the darkness. That doesn't explain the break-ins, Thomas said. Or the intimidation. Or someone entering our barn at night. For the first time, Victor looked uncomfortable. I never said I was responsible for any of that. You're not denying that someone is doing it. Victor remained silent. And that silence told Thomas more than any confession could have. A moment later, Victor made one final offer for the farm. Thomas refused. Victor walked back toward his vehicle, but before getting inside, he turned toward the barn. There was no curiosity in his eyes anymore. There was hunger. As the black car disappeared down the road, Margaret stood beside Thomas. This didn't begin with Victor. No, Thomas said quietly. He looked toward the barn. It began with his grandfather. And somewhere beneath their feet lay documents that might reveal something even darker. That Edwin Hale had not merely searched for Samuel's secret. He may have been the very man Samuel had learned to fear. Victor's confession changed everything. For days after he left, Thomas and Margaret continued sorting through Samuel Whitmore's private letters, hoping to understand how deeply the Hale family had been connected to the secret beneath the farm. But instead, Margaret found something far more personal. She was reading a faded letter when one surname caught her attention. She stopped. Read it again. Then reached for another letter. The same name appeared there too. Thomas noticed the color drain from her face. What is it? Margaret looked up slowly. That was my grandmother's maiden name. Thomas leaned closer. Are you sure? I heard it my entire childhood. She began searching through the letters more quickly. Soon other names appeared, names Margaret remembered from half-finished family stories told by her father decades earlier. People who had moved away. Relatives who had lost contact. Family members who seemed to vanish from history after some long-forgotten tragedy. By sunset, Margaret had arranged dozens of documents across the kitchen table. This can't all be coincidence, she whispered. Thomas looked at the names, dates, and places. For once, he had no practical explanation. They needed someone who understood family records. Several days later, a woman named Dr. Helen Carter arrived at the farm carrying 3 thick folders. She was a genealogical researcher specializing in reconstructing broken family lines from historical documents. They sat together in the kitchen. Helen spread birth certificates, old census records, parish documents, marriage registrations, and handwritten family trees across the table. I started with the Whitmore family, she explained. Margaret's heart began beating faster. Helen pointed to Samuel's name. Then she traced a line downward. After a series of tragedies many decades ago, this family split apart. Some relatives moved to other regions. Others changed communities. Records became incomplete. Entire branches lost contact with each other. She moved her finger farther across the page. Margaret suddenly recognized a name. My grandmother. Helen nodded. That's where things became interesting. The room went silent. Thomas reached for Margaret's hand. Helen continued connecting names. One generation. Then another. Then another. Until her finger finally stopped beside Margaret's name. She looked directly at her. Margaret. The evidence strongly suggests that you are a direct descendant of Samuel Whitmore. For several seconds, Margaret did not react. The words seemed too enormous to understand. No, she whispered. Helen gently pushed several documents toward her. I've checked the civil records, birth registrations, marriage certificates, and family correspondence. There are still minor details to verify, but the connection is extremely strong. Margaret stared at the family tree. Samuel Whitmore. The mysterious farmer. The man who had hidden families from danger. The man who had protected their belongings. The man who had disappeared while guarding a secret powerful enough to survive for generations. He was not merely the former owner of the farm. He was her blood. Margaret stood and walked slowly toward the window. Outside, the barn stood beneath the afternoon sun. For months she had believed she and Thomas had discovered the farm by accident. A cheap property. A desperate fresh start. Nothing more. Now that idea felt impossible. Thomas approached her quietly. How are you feeling? Margaret laughed softly, but tears filled her eyes. I don't even know. She looked back at Samuel's photograph lying on the table. All my life I thought I knew where I came from. Her voice broke. And now I find out an entire part of my family was buried beneath the ground. Thomas picked up the photograph. Samuel stood beside an old vehicle, his expression serious, almost guarded. Thomas studied his face. Maybe he always hoped someone from his family would find this place. Margaret looked at him. The thought sent a strange shiver through her. She remembered everything that had brought them here. Their children drifting away. The birthday party. Thomas's accident. Selling their house. Choosing this particular farm from hundreds of listings. The storm. The broken floor. The hidden door. Every painful decision seemed to form a path leading back to Samuel. That evening, Margaret returned to the underground chamber alone for a few minutes. She stood among the boxes Samuel had protected for people he barely knew. For the first time, she did not feel like an intruder. She felt connected to the man who had walked those same passages decades before. But the discovery brought something else too. If Margaret was Samuel Whitmore's direct descendant, then Victor Hale's obsession with the farm was about to collide with something he had never expected. Because the secret he believed his family had been chasing for generations had just found its way back into Samuel Whitmore's own bloodline. Several weeks after Margaret learned the truth about her connection to Samuel Whitmore, another discovery changed the atmosphere around the farm once again. Professional appraisers had spent days examining the jewelry, coins, precious metals, historical documents, and property records hidden beneath the barn. One afternoon, two financial experts arrived with Thomas and Margaret's attorney. Their expressions were unusually serious. We're still verifying several items, one of them explained. But there is something we can say with confidence. Thomas leaned forward. The man placed a folder on the table. The assets are worth several million. Margaret stared at him. For a moment she could not speak. They had bought the farm because it was cheap. They had wanted nothing more than a quiet place to grow old together. Now they were sitting on a fortune large enough to change generations. And soon the story escaped the farm. Journalists began calling. Historians requested interviews. Photographs of the barn appeared in newspapers. Then one afternoon, Margaret's phone rang. She looked at the screen and froze. Claire. Her daughter had barely called in months. Margaret answered cautiously. Mom? Claire's voice sounded warm. Almost too warm. She asked about Margaret's health. About Thomas. About the farm. About the lawyers. About the treasure. About the value of the property. When the call ended, Margaret remained staring at the phone. Thomas looked at her. That felt strange, didn't it? Margaret nodded. 2 days later, Ethan called. Then Lucas. Suddenly, the children who had once been too busy to speak for 5 minutes were calling several times a week. Messages appeared every morning. Video calls became common. Even the grandchildren began sending cheerful recordings. At first, Thomas and Margaret allowed themselves to enjoy it. Wasn't this what they had wanted for years? Their children were talking to them again. Asking questions. Laughing. Remembering birthdays. For a brief moment, Margaret wondered whether everything they had endured had somehow brought their family back together. But slowly a pattern emerged. Every conversation eventually returned to the same subjects. The fortune. The lawyers. The property. The money. One evening, Ethan asked Thomas casually, Dad, do they know exactly how much everything is worth? They're still evaluating some things. But you must have a rough number. Thomas felt something tighten inside him. Days later, Lucas began talking about businesses they could invest in once the legal situation was settled. Claire repeatedly asked which assets had been officially confirmed and how much would eventually remain under Thomas and Margaret's control. They tried not to judge. These were their children. Perhaps they were only curious. Perhaps they were worried. Perhaps. Then Ethan arrived at the farm one Saturday morning with his wife. Margaret was shocked. For years, a few hours of driving had supposedly been impossible. Now he had crossed hundreds of miles without hesitation. They ate together. They laughed. For several beautiful hours, Thomas almost believed the old family had returned. Then Ethan stood by the window looking across the property. This place must be worth a fortune now. Thomas said nothing. You two got incredibly lucky. Lucky. The word stayed with Margaret long after he left. A week later, Claire and Lucas came too. That evening, their children filled the farmhouse with conversation and laughter. Thomas watched them from across the room. Once this was all he had wanted. Yet somehow it no longer felt the same. Near midnight, Margaret woke thirsty and walked toward the kitchen. As she passed the living room, she heard voices. Her children were still awake. Then Ethan said something that stopped her cold. We need to discuss this before Mom and Dad decide what to do with everything. Claire answered quietly. I just hope they're fair. Lucas laughed. With that much money, all of us should be fine. Margaret's hand tightened around the wall. Then Ethan spoke again. The important thing is that they don't start giving it away. A pause. Claire replied. Exactly. Family should come first. Margaret closed her eyes. Family? For years Thomas had waited beside a silent telephone. For years Margaret had stared at empty chairs during holidays. When Thomas fell and needed stitches, none of them had come. But now there were millions beneath the farm. And suddenly everyone remembered the meaning of family. Margaret returned to the bedroom and told Thomas everything. He listened without anger. Without surprise. Only sadness. The next morning they watched their children differently. Not with hatred. Not with resentment. But with clarity. Thomas eventually looked toward Margaret and whispered, "Now I understand why they came back." Margaret lowered her eyes. They had spent years believing that losing their children was the most painful truth they would ever face. But now they were discovering something worse. Sometimes people returned. Not because they missed you, but because they finally wanted something you had. Thomas and Margaret could have spent the rest of their lives arguing about inheritance. They could have used the money to buy luxury, comfort, or the approval of children who had suddenly remembered how to come home. But they chose something else. After the legal disputes were settled, they used most of the fortune to create a foundation for elderly people who had been abandoned, forgotten, or left to grow old alone. The old farm changed completely. Empty buildings became warm rooms. The land became gardens and walking paths. And the barn that had once terrified an entire town became a place filled with conversation, music, meals, and laughter. Thomas often stood outside at sunset watching elderly residents sit together beneath the trees. One evening Margaret took his hand. "Do you ever think about how all of this started?" Thomas smiled. With two people waiting for a phone call that never came. Margaret looked toward the barn. And now no one here has to wait alone. That was when they understood the greatest truth of their journey. The real treasure had never been hidden beneath the ground. It was the chance to turn pain into purpose. Because sometimes life removes the people we expected to stay only to show us that family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes it is built through kindness, loyalty, presence, and the simple decision to make another human being feel seen. So, if this story touched you, ask yourself one question. Who in your life might be waiting for a call from you today? Share your answer in the comments. And if you believe stories like this still have something meaningful to teach us about love, family, and second chances, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next story.